So one thing that comes to mind for me, at least, is the move when I think of Halloween is old monster movies, and of course you can't think of old monster movies without thinking of Frankenstein. I remember. I think I got my big hook on Frankenstein came from I saw Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, and it was such a funny movie, and it actually kind of scared me when I was a little kid too. So I was like into all the Universal monsters. Like I was into Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein. I never really saw any of their movies, but I except for Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. But I was just so into them. And then AMC every October, I don't know if they do it anymore, but they did like their monster marathons where they would show all kinds of horror movies. And that around that time they were doing like marathons of like classic horror movies, not like some of the earlier black and white stuff, not like when it starts to get into like the slasher genre and stuff like that. So I had my mom tape like Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein off TV. And the first one I started to watch was Frankenstein, and I remember I was so pumped, like I knew who Boris Karloff was. I'm not sure if I read the book yet. Yeah, I read, well, technically I didn't read the book. I read like the children's abridged version. It wasn't like anything like too toned down. It got like the basic points, but I'm not sure if I read that before or after. But well, anyway, so like we recorded Frankenstein off TV. It actually took me a while to finally get around to watching it. It's kind of like the way I am today. I know there's movies I should be watching, but I just never feel like watching them. So yeah, when I finally saw Frankenstein, I watched like the first 20 minutes or so, at least until the point where like he finally resurrects the monster, and then I like stopped watching it, and I couldn't watch anymore because I had a feeling that it was gonna get really really scary, and I was like, oh man, I can't watch this. But eventually, I came back to watching it, and I remember so many things about that movie. I remember Fritz switching the brains. I remember I remember the finale, and I remember him throwing the monster throwing flower petals into the water with the girl. I mean, it's been such a long time since that movie came out. A lot of people forget what the original was actually like. For one thing, he hardly struts around with his arms out like this. I mean, that became a stereotype somehow throughout the films. The Hunchback isn't named Igor; it's named Fritz. The character Igor didn't appear until like a Frankenstein sequel, I think. And of course, it's parodied in Young Frankenstein. He's called Igor. Young Frankenstein is a very funny movie. I highly recommend checking that out too. So, just Frankenstein left a big impact on me as a kid. For one, it was probably the first movie to be classifiable in the horror genre that I had seen. So that was a big deal for me. This was before I saw Night of the Living Dead too, so I didn't fully appreciate scary movies yet. I didn't watch any of them because I didn't like being scared. So you're hearing me ramble on about Frankenstein. You're probably wondering what are my thoughts on the other Universal monsters. Well, The Bride of Frankenstein, I remember bits and pieces of that. I remember that it adds. I must have read Frankenstein before I saw the movie because I remember that I realized that they added parts from the novel that weren't in the first film. Like the fact that Dr. Frankenstein makes a bride for the creature. That's actually in the novel. So I remember bits and pieces of that. I remember like the scenes with the blind man, again parodied in Young Frankenstein. But like I remember the Wolfman kind of. I think I was like only half watching that one, but I remember a few things from that, like the transformation scenes and stuff. But other than that, like Creature from the Black Lagoon and Dracula, I don't think I actually ever saw those. I really need to get around to watching those to complete like my full circle of the Universal monsters. But I don't think I ever got around to seeing those. Frankenstein, I definitely remember the most though, because it was so cool to finally see like Frankenstein being, or the Frankenstein's monster being Frankenstein's monster. Isn't that like everyone's big pet peeve that knows the movie and the story? The monster isn't Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the doctor. The monster is Frankenstein's monster. But anyway, I digress. Frankenstein just it left a lot with me as a kid. I remember a whole bunch of stuff from it. I remember Boris Karloff. I remember Colin Clive as the doctor. This is a really, really entertaining movie. A really great start to the horror genre, even though it had starts in the silent era and whatnot. But yeah, it's definitely it's not really corny or really campy like a lot of people might think it to be. So it is actually a film that can be taken seriously. So I would, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend giving it a watch, because it's definitely memorable and it's definitely a good piece of film history.